The race is on to clean up as much of the snow as possible before the next round moves in. Crews are out in force, shoveling, blowing, and plowing massive mountains of ice and snow as far out of the way as possible, even if they run out of places to put it all. Governor Charlie Baker also announced today that he's calling in about 500 National Guard troops with heavy equipment to clear out roads and fire hydrants. And then there's the T. At this point, the MBTA still isn't certain when full and complete service will be restored. And in response to some harsh criticism from Governor Baker, T General Manager Beverly Scott is fired up.
I have been through hurricanes, I've been through World Trade Center bombings, tornadoes coming, 30 inches, 36 inches, and all that. So this ain't this woman's first rodeo.
MBTA General Manager Beverly Scott came out swinging today, defending her agency and her employees from critics who say the T failed during Monday's storm.
Those folks that are out there and are continuing to be out there and will stay out there are giving it. They are absolutely poetry in motion, and they are tired. But they love this Commonwealth. They love this place, and they are giving it all they have.
Those comments followed Scott's decision to shut down the T's trains at 7 p.m. last night. And they were a clear rebuttal to Governor Charlie Baker, who hinted yesterday that the T's snowstorm struggles could lead to Scott's ouster.
We've been frustrated, disappointed with the performance of the T, but this performance is simply not acceptable.
If the governor is frustrated with the T's general manager, the feeling may be mutual.
I have had absolutely no direct communication with the governor. I'm not going to try to characterize the governor is supposed to be, and I'm delighted to have the conversation. He's going to come by here, as we understand it, later this week, talk to our employees, and that will honestly be the first time that, candidly, I've ever had even a handshake, from the governor.
But Scott's bigger point was that without new investment, the T can't work as well as it should.
For anyone to have any belief that a system that's over 100 years old, that's got equipment, much of it that is running out there on this red and this orange lines that are at much over capacity, can continue with the age that it is, and to think that it's going to have the resilience to wind up rebounding and flying like an eagle, that is absolutely the epitome of, and I'm not going to say foolish.
Speaking shortly after Scott wrapped up her remarks, the governor struck a more conciliatory note.
Beverly Scott is doing everything she possibly can, and I'm not going to have any comment at all with respect to any of this. First of all, I don't have the authority to do it, and secondly, I'm not going to have any comment on any of this until I have a chance to have a direct conversation with the T about why they didn't live up to the representations they made to us and to others over the course of the past 2 weeks.
But Baker also said he's skeptical of calls for greater investment.
My view on this continues to be the same, which is we need to start from the premise the taxpayers have been taxed enough.
And given that massive philosophical difference, it's hard to imagine the partnership between Baker and Scott ending well. This latest storm has clearly brought a lot of simmering issues to a boiling point. Joining me now to talk more about that is Raphael Mayers, a transportation law expert from the Conservation Law Foundation, and Charlie Chipio, who served as policy director of administration and finance during the Romney administration and is now a public policy advocate. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I should mention at the outset, apparently there's going to be some rail service tomorrow run by the T, but not full perhaps. We don't know yet. Let me get your take, both of you, on what explains the T's current woes and the sort of system-wide meltdown that we saw yesterday. Let's start with you, Raphael.
Well, first of all, we have an unprecedented snowstorm or series of snowstorms here. These are unprecedented weather conditions. And if you add to that we have a very old infrastructure and vehicles in place that makes it impossible. And then you have to consider that there has been years and years of underinvestment in the T. A deferral of maintenance, essentially, that led up to this. And this doesn't come to surprise to anybody who's been following the finances of the T.
Charlie, what's your assessment?
Well, I would agree with everything that Raphael just said. I think all of that is absolutely true. I think where Raphael and I would probably disagree is I think, to me, there's one other piece to that, which is the fact that at this point, about half of the T's debt, which is one of the reasons that the maintenance has been deferred and we've had all these problems, is because the T was forced over 20 years ago to build 14 new projects as environmental mitigation for the T, or for the Big Dig. The cost of that, when you add up the construction cost, the maintenance operations, all of that, it really adds up to just about half of the T's debt. And I think that was a catastrophic decision. I still think that I agree with Raphael that we would have problems, and there has been investment anyway, but I think that has dramatically exacerbated the situation.
And just for people who may not know the history, what are some of those projects that were built to help mitigate the Big Dig?
The Green Line, or the commuter rail extension to Worcester, Greenbush, Newburyport. There's a bunch of other. The Green Line extension that's happening right now.
New Blue Line cars to the airport. That's why the Blue Line functions a little better now than the others. We still have signal and power problems on that line, but there are new trains. Upgrades to the stations along the Blue Line. All those are part of the investment that was necessary, and without it, quite frankly, that wouldn't have been a Big Dig or any of the transportation improvements that we've seen.
So it sounds like you don't buy Charlie's idea that those Big Dig projects were or are part of the problem that we're
No,
facing
they're not.
today?
They're not the reason that we have these problems. They have helped build a transportation system that we need. You have to understand, in 2005, just to go back to that, we had 1.1 million daily riders on the T. Right now we have 1.3. We're projected to have 1.4 to 1.6 million riders by 2020. We can't expect our system to look exactly the way it did in the 80s or 90s. It has to grow.
And I agree with that, except for you have a situation here where Boston is one of the slowest growing metropolitan areas in the country, and for 25 years we have had by far the fastest growing transit authority, and there has been no funding for any of it. And so that is what has put us on the highway to this disaster that we're facing now. Again, I'm not saying this as if there hasn't been underfunding, because there has, but I think it's a two-pronged problem.
I want to show this video that has been making the rounds of social media. I think one or both of you may have seen it, but it's a Canadian National Railway train moving through a snowy field, and you see it just absolutely plowing through what looks like a pretty serious amount of snow. It's sort of what all of us wish the T-trains that were ground to a halt could do. Okay, so here it comes. You see it coming down this bucolic Canadian prairie, I assume. And in just a few moments, we're going to get this very, very dramatic shot of the train, kicking up a huge cloud of snow. We may not be able to wait long. I recall the train moving a little faster than it seems to be moving there. But let me ask you, why can't... There we go. There's the money shot. So do you have a grasp of why it is that our trains here in the Boston area are incapable of doing what it seems that train just did?
A third of the Red Line trains are from 1969. That's the Nixon administration. If you had a clunker from 1969 sitting in your driveway today, I don't think you would take it for a spin. And I'm not sure what this train compares to, but it's obviously new and a much better machine.
And I would agree with that, except for I would say that the reason that they're from 1969 is the T was forced to spend a lot of money on expansion that it didn't have, and if it didn't have to expand more than it should have, those trains wouldn't have been from 1969, and we would have been able to better maintain the system.
Raphael?
We actually now have the revenue to purchase Red and Orange Line cars, and they have been ordered, and that's the good news. Unfortunately, it takes a while you can't just go on the lot and pick out your Red and Orange Line trains and put them on the tracks. They have to be built, assembled. There has to be a 500-mile operational test before they can be put into service. So we will see the first ones in 2019. So
that's a long ways away.
It's a long ways away. And had we solved this financial problem early on by raising more revenue the way we did in 2013, we wouldn't see this problem right now.
Go ahead.
No, I think one thing that Raphael and I would agree on is the fact that I would peg it somewhere around 2002. We can argue about the date, but it was clear that long ago where this was headed, and nothing has been done.
I agree with that. In 2000, forward funding was supposed to help the T. We dedicated sales tax is what the T got, and the projections never came true, and we never made that adjustment. And
forward funding meaning that it's not going to be budgeted into the state's budget every year, right?
Exactly, so that we know beforehand and the T has how much money the T is going to get, and they have to have a balanced budget. And that's been the case ever since, except the sales tax projections have not come true, and they didn't come true immediately. Charlie's right about that, and so back then we already knew we had a problem, and it took until 2013 to fix half of that problem.
Let me ask both of you, if you were asked by, say, Governor Baker to come in and fix the T, given carte blanche to make whatever administrative reforms you needed to make, to spend whatever you thought you might need to spend, to go to the legislature and say, hey, we need to come up with this new funding mechanism with a guarantee that they comply, which they might or might not. What would you do? Charlie, let's have you take a crack at this first.
I would start by, I wrote this in a column recently. I would basically say, stop all expansion. I would increase funding. I would create a bunch of performance metrics, increase funding based on achieving those metrics, understanding that they can't be very aggressive right now because they don't have the capacity.
By performance metrics, you mean things like on time number of trains running,
all that kind of thing. Exactly. I would add the funding immediately from the gas tax, but going forward, move away from the gas tax and do it from the revenue from electronic tolling on metropolitan area highways.
Okay. Raphael?
Well, I would say that we have to look at the individual problems that we have. You red and orange line cars, big problem already being ordered. The power and signal system of the T, the infrastructure is very old. We have about $25 million set aside over the next 5 years. We need about $300 million. That has to be prioritized. And then the green line vehicles are also from the 1980s, like the orange line vehicles. They're going to have to be procured. The sooner we start that process, the better, and we don't have the money set aside for that.
So let's say again, hypothetically, if Governor Baker said to you, Raphael, I want to make whatever you think needs to happen happen, but I really don't want to spend, or I don't want to tax people. I believe that people are being taxed enough. Would you tell him, no, we need to be taxed more?
I would tell him that people don't like to be taxed and they don't like fees. But when you ask them, would you be willing to pay higher taxes or higher fees for transportation to improve our transportation system? The answer he will hear is yes.
Yeah, I would say one other thing about that. I think that's absolutely right. I've been hearing a lot about people outside of 495 who are complaining about this. They don't want to pay for the T, and I understand that. That's kind of human nature in a sense. But I would say this, and as not being a public official, I can say this kind of thing. I think the kind of rolling depression that you would see, the impact that you would see on the economy beyond 495, beyond the borders of Massachusetts, if we just let the T die, would change a lot of people's minds very quickly.
And do you think we're at a point where that is a possible outcome? The T is just allowed to
look, we can't let the T die. I think there are things like I'm blanking on the word when the government takes them over. Receivership.
Yes.
Things like that are, I think, are a possibility. We've let this fester for a long time, and it has gotten dramatically worse during that time.
I want to take a look at some more that Beverly Scott had to say in her press conference today, and I'd like to get your take on whether she helped herself or not. She has, I think it's fair to say, a flamboyant public communication style, which we're not entirely familiar with here in Massachusetts. At one point, she said that essentially there is no panacea or magic bullet to fixing problems like the one the T was grappling with yesterday, that it requires a massive amount of very difficult, sort of basic physical labor. Let's take a listen to how she described it.
I don't have any buttons I can push. You are talking about people literally out there with pickaxes, shovels, and propane tanks that are getting those old switches, just like in the old railroad movies you see, that are actually making those switches get from being de-iced.
What did you make of her performance at this presser? And do you think that she made her case effectively?
I think that we have a situation where you are giving Dr. Scott a Geo Metro and you're expecting her to enter a NASCAR race, and then you're criticizing her for not winning that race. It's impossible to do that with the system that she has.
And do you think she conveyed that effectively?
And I think the reason she's talking like that is that she probably hasn't slept for a long time, and it's really not fair to her staff to be criticized for these heroic efforts. They've been working nonstop for the last few weeks, trying to help us get the system going and keeping it going as much as possible. So I really do understand where she's coming from.
Charlie, I was going to ask you to weigh in on that piece of video, but instead I want to turn to another one. There are dueling accounts between Governor Baker and Beverly Scott of what was promised yesterday for this limited schedule that the T was going to be operating on and what was delivered. The governor essentially says that promises were made, and Beverly Scott says that they were not. Let's take a listen to how they describe it.
We spent a lot of time over the course of the weekend talking to the folks at the T to make sure that they would be able to run at least an abbreviated schedule today. We've been disappointed by the fact that even that abbreviated schedule hasn't been able to be maintained.
Oh, we have made absolutely anybody who would try to make a promise about what Mother Nature was going to wind up doing during this condition, and I don't think anybody would have ever thought, nobody could ever have thought that. That would have been completely foolish.
All right, Charlie, you've spent some time in state government.
I would say that aside from that, I would say that as a married person, we clearly have a communication problem here. And it would seem to me that, what needs to happen is, that the governor and Dr. Scott probably need to have some direct conversations here. because obviously the working through intermediaries is obviously not working.
Did it surprise you, by the way, for her to say that the communication from the governor was coming through Stephanie Pollack, the Secretary of Transportation? Is that normal?
We're dealing with a major crisis here, and I think they're all deep in it, in the snow and all the problems that come with it. And the governor is doing his best job, and so is the general manager. And I think there's probably a line of communication that's going here. I would agree with Charlie that it'd be good at this point for them to talk to each other. And I think what they will find is that they actually like each other and they'll be able to work this out together because they're both very interesting people that have given their best to try to get us out of this situation.
All right, let's leave it on that upbeat note. Raphael Mayers, Charlie Chipio, thank you both.